Well, it's time. On Friday, it's one of our usual days where balance tuning might land in the PTR, and this was one of those days because we have our 5th set of balance tuning of the past couple of weeks. At this point, this one is very fruitful because we have quite a few significant changes, both when it comes to buffing and also when it comes to nerfing. So we start on a good note by talking about buffs, or I guess it's a bad note because the buff is trying to repair what damage was done. The damage we are talking about was the mega nerf going the way of Keeper of the Grove's Balanced Druid. We have covered an entire video about how the Keeper of the Grove degeneracy was going, and then Blizzard nerfed such degeneracy last patch. It broke balance, it sent it from an S plus tier spec, especially Mythic Plus, down to a, B plus, A minus kind of spec. So Blizzard now is trying to repair a bit the damage by buffing all of Balance's damage by 8%. This is good, but still not back up to that, pre-nerf S tier value they had before. So they have, they are more at risk of losing their, for example, their Mythic Plus meta spot still after the nerf they have received last time to Keeper of the Grove. Because their current version, of Eluna's Chosen Balanced Druid in Mythic Plus is still powerful, right? It's still valuable for blanket mass AoE the same way you are using them right now. So that will still be a very high chance at being good in Mythic Plus after these buffs. You're just losing the novelty of that Keeper of the Grove niche you had before it was nerfed, even with this 8% buff. The other change was Windwalker's damage buffed by 5%. It's pretty interesting since Windwalker was reasonably untouched throughout all of these sets of tuning we have been mentioning. Windwalker was doing just middling to low half of the meter's damage, at least when it came to testing. It also wasn't a particularly popular spec in Mythic Plus right now in the PTR, so just buffing them flat by 5% doesn't improve much of anything in Mythic Plus, in the sense that they are still too target capped to be very, very powerful in Mythic Plus, and it makes their single target slightly better, although still not in the top echelon, top third of performing specs right now, anyways, for Windwalker. Where we get more interesting changes that aren't just some, plus or minus percentage changes are for DKs. So Unholy and Frost are getting changes. Unholy is getting their Undeath and their White Mane's Epidemic damage being reduced, a lot of damage reduction. However, your Sun Lane is also being nerfed as well, because Infliction of Sorrow now deals 30% damage increase instead of 50%. Now this is creating an interesting situation where now you have Sun Lane to be very close in damage with your Rider build. Basically within 2-ish% of damage for single target are now both builds. In terms of talents itself, it's not that much of anything is changing. If you haven't missed the memo, the no pet build, which lasted basically all of last season for Unholy, is dead. Now you're back taking your minion, or rather your pet talents again. You are done going down your super strain side, which is now 3 to 5% behind in terms of single target damage for both builds. And you still have benefits for both, because even if Sun Lane is slightly ahead of Rider does have better AoE and better cleave power, especially in your raid single target build compared to Sun Lane. So they both have uses in the raid, even after both of these changes, which were basically just nerfs for both, except Sun Lane was worse than Rider. However, we also have continued nerfs for Frost DK. All ability damage reduced by 3%, but Frostbane damage has been increased by 15%. Now this has created a pretty interesting, slight awkward situation for Frost, because right now this is doing pretty good damage. This is actually pretty valuable. Obviously, if you're not used to this, especially because this was a completely underused talent, this is for AoE. Each foe struck with Glacial Advance has a chance to transform your next Frost Strike into an empowered one, Frostbane, so it's for AoE. So obviously this isn't really changing changing what you want to do in single target. In single target, you're still going for your breath build. You are ditching, of course, some of these AoE talents, and you're going for breath. However, what's the uniqueness in this one being good now? The uniqueness in Frostbane being good is that you will want to play with Frostbane with a two-handed weapon. Whereas with Breath, you are playing dual wield DK. So it creates this awkward situation where if this becomes the new way to go in Mythic Plus, and obviously Breath remains your best option in the raid, in single target, you now want to play dual wield and two-handed weapon at the same time, depending on whether or not you're doing Mythic Plus or the raid, which is, you know, quite annoying considering how hard it is to get weapons. First of all, it would be quite awkward for Frost DK to manage both at the same time. You're still, that being said, a very good spec. You're doing very high damage even after this nerf. You're still slightly ahead of Unholy, for example, in terms of damage, and the spec is still good. You still just now have an extra option, an extra possibility of playing with Frostbane in Mythic Plus. Weird what we're getting with Vengeance, because Vengeance is getting their damage buff by 8%, which is understandable given that in Mythic Plus you had Prot Warrior, even the multiple times nerfed Prot Paladin, and already, of course, Master Monk doing very good damage. Vengeance was lagging behind, fine, buff them. Sure, some players might mention, hold on a second, Vengeance is already the meta tank, Vengeance is already very powerful, why are we buffing them? That is a understandable concern. What they get nerfed though is very weird, because they get their mastery nerfed. They get their mastery value nerfed by 17%. And mastery, of course, is fully defensive for Vengeance. It's just armor. So you just become weaker to physical damage. Now, what is confusing about this change is that Vengeance was already ignoring mastery. Vengeance was going for haste and then crit. No interest in mastery. Mastery was already weaker than the value of crit, which, if you don't know about, for tanks, crit is converted into parry chance for Vengeance. So already getting parry from your crit, on top of course doing more damage because of crit, was more valuable than the value of this mastery. So now that you nerf mastery, you just make the secondary even more dead. It feels like it would have been a much better solution if you buffed the mastery of Vengeance by like 30% to make the secondary actually valuable going after, and then nerfing the base of Vengeance, like for example Thick Skin, one of the base modifier of the spec. Just make the armor increase of Thick Skin nerfed down to 100%, but buff the mastery. So now you can have more value from mastery while still being nerfed by default, but still having, you know, good use of your secondary stats on your gear. Instead, this nerf is a bit weird because mastery was already quite weak for Vengeance. Guardian gets a similar change. We mentioned the specs for tanks doing good damage. Guardian was not one of them, so now they also get buffed. Also buff for Feral Druid, 8% damage increase. Not much else really to mention about this. It's a flat 8% damage. Looking at the overall damage, Feral was in an even worse position than Windwalker. They weren't doing particularly well overall, so this buff will help them a bit, just like Windwalker, but it won't really change much about their situation, which seems to be the usual situation they are in every tier, which is mid to bottom level as a spec. Evoker gets some pretty nice buffs across the board. Augmentation gets buffed by 5%, luckily they are still dead. Devastation gets buffed by 3% overall, and then 20% to Pyre and Firestorm, mostly for their AoE damage. What is more irrelevant though is the buff to Chronowarden. Now additionally causes Temporal Burst to increase the damage and healing of Essence abilities by 30%. This is massive because, in case you're not aware about, Preservation, and I guess of course also Augmentation, does have the 2-piece buff which makes Tip the Scales have a 1-minute cooldown. It goes from 2 to 1. Temporal Burst is what you gain when you activate Tip the Scales, and what it does is it's gonna give you a 30% haste, movement speed, and CDR decreasing every second for 30 seconds. This is very powerful because now this has a 1-minute cooldown and this lasts for 30 seconds. So you press this, it goes on a 60-second cooldown. For 30 seconds, this buff will be active. So when this buff is over, 30 seconds have passed. which means only 30 seconds are left on the cooldown of Tip the Scales. So you wait 30 seconds, it comes off cooldown, you use this again, and this goes on a 30-second duration. So this buff will basically have a 50% act time. It will be active for 30 seconds, this will be on cooldown for 30, active for 30, on cooldown for 30. So having an extra to increase the damage and healing of your essence abilities by 30% for basically 50% of the time is very good for Chronowarden. Unfortunately, at the moment, the only value on your essence ability is your Emerald Blossom, which also unfortunately is not a very used and powerful build, because you would have to play this in the raid, but in the raid you're playing Flame Shaper, which is better. So even though this 30% heal increase looks juicy for Chronowarden, it's not that valuable right now. At least until we enter a world where Emerald Blossom builds are the way to go for Evoker in the raid. So this is still definitely more valuable in terms of damage increase for augmentation, to get the 30% damage increase for the spec rather than the healing for Preservation Evoker. Now, you can fully disregard this. You can fully disregard Dark Ranger buffs into Pack Leader nerfs. Doesn't matter. This doesn't matter. Pack Leader is still the only talent you will play as BM. Dark Ranger is still too weak. In fact, the only interesting thing happening for BM right now is not these changes, but rather whether or not in Mythic Plus you are going to be playing with multi-shot or not. Yeah, it seems weird, right? You are in Mythic Plus, you are in AoE, which means you want to multi-shot to generate Beast Cleave, to make your pets cleave, to then also gain Kill Cleave to splash damage with your kill command. However, right now, you have so many free sources of AoE damage, like playing Pack Leader, your Boar will do AoE damage, your Bear will do AoE damage, your Tier Set, your Stampede will do AoE damage, your Stomp will do AoE damage, and your entire line down your Dire Beasts will be summoned, your Dire Beasts will be summoned already with Beast Cleave active on them. So hunters are hypothesizing being able to save 3 talents, which is a lot of damage that you can spend elsewhere, 3 full talents somewhere else without having to play with Beast Cleave by yourself to get it for free and gain AoE damage from your other sources, to be able to still play a Mythic Plus build more single target focused, more prio damage focused, without having to use 3 talents for this AoE line down here. That's pretty much the only interesting thing happening for BM right now. Definitely not these hero talent changes, which are pretty much pointless. You're still playing Pack Leader anyways. For marksmanship, yeah, it's our 4th line in a row of nerfs. Black Arrow is nerfed again, Sentinel is nerfed again. We had an entire video about the power of marksmanship literally a few days ago, so we just cursed marksmanship to be nerfed, of course. They are still very good, and they're still in the same situation they were before. This is more hurtful of a nerf than this for Sentinel, but it also was somewhat expected, just like the last bit of nerf for BM, which is 5% overall damage nerf. Both of the Hunter specs though were doing very well, and they are continuing to do very well. Talking about doing very well, it definitely has not been the PTR cycle for Mage, because across the timeline of balance tuning, Mage has been changed a lot. This time the change was centered around Fire Mage. So Fire Mage had a change to Sun Fury a couple of weeks ago. You had the buff after your 4-piece reduced to 10 seconds. You had the hyperthermia extension reduced from 1 second per sphere to half a second per sphere. In the patch after, you had the spell damage increase of your Spellfire sphere from 2% to 1%. In the patch after, it was the beginning of the huge nerf. The ignite effectiveness of Frostfire went from 150% to 100. You also had the initial spike damage reduced by 20%. And then the one after that was the final nail in the coffin. Frostfire Fire ignite effectiveness went from 150 to 100 to 50. The damage of your 3 abilities, especially Comet Storm, went from 20 to 10. Glacial Spike ate another 40% nerf. And then another big nerf to your Sun Fury buffs. You're now gaining 12% haste instead of 25% after your combustion, and further hyperthermia extension reduced from 1 second to 0.5 to 0.25. And the spell damage bonus you were gaining in that window went from 20% to 10%. Blizzard tried to compensate for this, all damage buffs plus pyro plus flame strike, but it was still too big of a nerf, especially for Frostfire. Frostfire was still dead. So the changes now are buffs to Frostfire. Frostfire burst is buffed by 50%. The effectiveness of excess frost, Ice Nova, is up to 200% instead of 150. The ignite value is up again from 150 to 100 to 50 up to 75%. The damage increase of your hits went from 30 to 20 to 10, now it's up to 15% again. TLDR, trash. This is still bad, not good, unplayable. You're still playing with Sun Fury. Sun Fury isn't getting buffed. You're in fact getting nerfed in your value of mastery by 10%. This is a bit dangerous because it goes to hurt your Mythic Plus build, since obviously when you play Mythic Plus you can focus more on flame striking, and flame striking has less value with Ignite and more value with the direct hit of flame strike, whereas if you want to do the Ignite spreading build, you will still be spamming Pyro in AoE and then spread the Ignite. So this is obviously a nerf to the Pyro AoE build of fire because your Ignite value is now lower. Overall, this still keeps Sun Fury as your best option in both activities, especially in single target. You're still playing with the Unleashed Inferno, no Sun King's Blessing build, and of course with your hyperthermia and your own Sun Fury's hyperthermia with the buffs from your tier set even after these changes. The attempt at buffing, at compensating Frostfire after all of its nerfs is not enough. This is still too weak for Frostfire. We get changes to Shadow Priest. This is very relevant. You get 30% buff to Mind Blast, not Void Blast, only the Mind Blast version of the ability. Mind Flay Insanity is buffed by 20%, Halo by 30%, Psychic Link, change number 74 of the past 3 expansions, is back up to inflict 40% of its damage to all other targets afflicted by VT instead of 35%. And then Insidious Ire now has less damage boost than before. This TLDR means that Void Weaver is nerfed by just a tiny bit, because they did make use of Insidious Ire, and of course they don't make use of Halo. So they don't get buffed in Halo because they don't get the mega damage like they do with Archon, and they get nerfed in Insidious Ire. So overall, this is a slight nerf for Void Weaver, but it's a big chunky buff for Archon. Archon doesn't play with Insidious Ire, so the nerf doesn't affect them, but they do play, of course, with Halo. Very high Halo damage because of playing Archon. So this results in being like a 1 to 2% very minor damage nerf for Void Weaver, but an 8 to 9% damage buff for Archon. Now Archon is very close to similar damage with Void Weaver. So they are now possibly paired together in the raid in value, with Archon still being more powerful in Mythic Plus. This has revitalized the values, the viability of Archon as a hero talent for Shadow. However, the buff of the week goes to Elemental, and we have complained as we scrolled through these tuning of the past 2 weeks, where is Elemental? We kept scrolling down every videos we had, where is Elemental? Elemental was missing. You know, this was actually a nerf for Elemental, for Stormbringer. And then we keep scrolling. A couple of weeks ago, the first of the set of tuning, no Elemental buffs. And then we go back to the damage of the specs in the tuning, and you know, Elemental was not having a great time, especially in their single target, was very poor. So this is of course self-explanatory. 25% damage buff to your Elemental Blast, 35, 35, 35 to Lightning Bolt, Lava Burst and Earthen Rage, 50% to Frost Shock, 25% to Earth Shock, and 35% to Ice Fury. So mega buffs given to your, Farseer single target stock damage build. Obviously, this would average a 30–33% damage boost if all of your damage was from these abilities. But of course, since you play Farseer, a good chunk of your damage is from your grandpas, from your ancestors, right? So technically, this is about an 18% damage buff for Farseer. This becomes an even bigger buff because right now Blizzard pushed an undocumented buff for Elemental. We might not even know if at the moment it might be just a mistake, right? Somehow this changed. The change is that for Farseer right now, this has been changed. Ancestral Swiftness no longer reduces the cast time of your spells by 25% for 8 seconds. Now it increases the damage of your spells by 25% for 8 seconds. So swapping a cast time reduction for a damage increase is a 6% damage buff to this 4-piece. So with your 18% damage buff here, plus the undocumented change of your tier set, you are in the realm of some 23-ish% damage increase for the spec. So right now we only have some, napkin early level sims for specs, and the idea seems to be that average specs are simming in single target within 5.6 to 5.7 million damage. The good specs, the ones that are good, are simming in the 6 million plus level right now in the testing. Now Elemental was doing very poorly. Elemental was simming some barely 5 million DPS, which is of course terrible compared to, as we mentioned just now, DKs. However, with a 23% damage buff, your 5 million DPS would jump up to be a 6.2 million DPS. So this mega buff would bring you right up at the same level of DKs, which right now are a couple of the best performing specs in terms of sims, in terms of single target damage. This would be a very good, very good last minute change for Elemental for their single target power, because in terms of AoE, they were already doing fine. And it's worth mentioning that their Stormbringer build, which was already doing fine, is still going to benefit from all of this. Of course, they won't make much of any use of this because being Stormbringer, most of their damage will be Chain Lightning and Earthquake and Tempest, but Lightning Bolt is still going to be valued by Stormbringer very much. So it's also, although of course much smaller, but it's also a buff to your Mythic Plus build, to your AoE build. Now the last of the interesting changes, skipping past Warriors, getting a flat 5% buff. Warriors were a slightly upgraded version of Feral and Windwalker, both Arms and Fury, they were doing like around middling damage overall throughout all of the testing, while still doing quite poorly in Mythic Plus, so it's just an expected buff for two reasonably underperforming spec. The more relevant change is for Diabolist in particular and for Affliction. That's because Demo was ultra buffed last week. You had doubled the value of damage of your 2-piece, and then 50% damage buff from pretty much all of your demons in your Diabolist Hero Talent 3, and Infernal Bolt was now hitting for like 6 million non-crits. It was a massive set of buffs, which made Demo even stronger than it was compared to these two pieces of garbage over here in its class. So Blizzard is, pulling back a little bit. They are adjusting the damage, previously buffed by 100% down by 45%, and then nerfing these abilities down by 20% after being buffed by 50. So it's still a buff overall. So the buff now is not 100, it's 55, and these buffs are not 50% more damage, it's 30% more damage with these nerfs in mind. That being said, Demo is still by far the best simming spec out of the Warlocks, and currently one of the best simming specs after the last week's round of buffs. The only spec of Warlock that is comfortably past the 6 million DPS simming right now. Affliction does get a couple of buffs, but a very particularly good one. These two are okay. UA buff by 35% and your Dark Lair, your cooldown 35% stronger is good. What is really good is this. Focused Malignancy now causes your Rapture to deal 80% increased damage to targets suffering from your UA instead of 40. So this is a 100% increase, right? This is just a funnel damage. It's prio damage. It's a way for you, when you're doing your blanket AoE, storing your soul shards and then spamming your Malefic Rapture in your 1 minute CD windows you can have as an Affliction Warlock in Mythic Plus. Now you have significantly increased single target damage to your priority target, even in AoE, even in Mythic Plus. This is very valuable in Mythic Plus, as you might know already. The priority damage to the most dangerous target, usually the highest HP target, in order to shave his HP better than all of the minions with low HP around him. This is very good for Affliction in Mythic Plus. Obviously it still works in pure single target, because in single target you will have your Unstable Affliction on the boss, obviously, but you need a bit more for Affliction to be competitive with Demo in terms of single target damage in a raid setting. But in AoE, in Mythic Plus, it is very good for the spec. So these are all of the relevant changes we are getting on this Saturday. Very nice to have Blizzard continue to have these often sets of balance tuning for the specs as we keep getting closer to the season. Very good. Let's hope that we continue to have these double sets of tuning every week until the season is out. But for today, though, on this weekend, on this Saturday, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting as usual by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting Competi for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thanks again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, finally, yes, as usual, my trust in meteorologists was right. We have now a couple of days into our chill week of no sweating and no heat.